Modern Britain loves its heritage. It's become a vital part of how we define ourselves as British.
The fascination that people show for history, I think, is extraordinary, but I think it comes from a really deep human need to understand where we've come from and why things matter, and actually to help us locate ourselves in the present.
But it could so easily have been a different story. It's taken a revolution to make us a nation that values our ancient buildings and monuments. And even now, it's an ongoing argument about what to save and what to let go.
Heritage isn't really about the past, it's about the future. And it's about what you do with the future and what bits of the past you want to take with you into the future. And that's quite a tricky subject, because what's important, particularly about the recent past to one person, is not important to another person.
Britain now has some of the most powerful conservation laws in the world. But in the 19th century, hardly any of our best-loved landmarks were protected or even valued. It was a dangerous time for old and ancient buildings, caught up in an age of industry and profit.
Because Britain was expanding and was therefore beginning to destroy the material past, there were visionaries who realized that the landscape, the built environment, represents memory, and memory was something that shouldn't be lost.
The pioneers of the movement were clever, passionate, and argumentative. They changed the history of this country by saving it. Sometimes they looked like antiquities themselves, but they all challenged society in surprising ways.
Well, the fascinating thing is that the conservation movement has been, at times, really, really radical, even to the point of being quite revolutionary.
Some chose Parliament to further the cause. Others campaigned in pressure groups. Many supporters were rich and powerful. Others took to the streets to make a point. Some were free-thinking civil servants. A handful even operated undercover, theatrical in their stunts to save history. This is the story of how the heritage movement was ignited by the modern science of evolution and archaeology, of how a century of astonishing change nearly wiped out the past, and the ghastly fallout of war. It's about who decided what was worth saving, why they did it, and how they shaped the Britain we recognize today. We boast that an Englishman's home is his castle. But for centuries, it has been this very belief that threatened the survival of Britain's past. Every historic site belonged to someone, and that someone could do whatever they liked with it.
There are a number of terrible examples of buildings being demolished by their owners just because people were interested in them. New Place in Stratford-on-Avon, Shakespeare's house, was demolished in the 1750s by, he was a clergyman, because he was irritated by people coming to see it, and so he pulled it down. And of course you have wonderful Vanbrugh pleading for the preservation of Woodstock Manor, which the ghastly Duchess of Marlborough was going to demolish. At the beginning of the 19th century, Turner, the great painter who just moved to Twickenham, was furious to find that Pope's Villa nearby was just being demolished by Baroness Howe, who again was irritated that people were curious and wanted to see this house. So there's a terrible history of this sort of thing, of private individuals thinking they have the absolute right to destroy something just because they own it, even if they are of wide interest or indeed of national importance.
For centuries, the right to own property without interference from the state had been at the heart of the British Constitution. To compromise this principle would be revolutionary stuff.
Why was Britain different from the rest of Europe? They'd had revolutions. Revolutions had eliminated private property. The state had taken over responsibility in France for ancient monuments, for forests and so on. In Britain, private property was all, and there was a general feeling that that was the key to Britishness, why we were a success, as we were perceived as being then, is because we respected people's property.
In the 19th century, Britain controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen. Queen Victoria had even added the title Empress of India to her property portfolio. At home and abroad, the idea of British land rights had never seemed stronger. Yet, in the summer of 1873, they were about to be challenged in, of all places, the House of Commons. The battle for heritage began with John Lubbock, Liberal MP for Orpington in Kent. He was 39 years old, the son of a London banker and baronet. He was posh and rich, and a hyperactive champion of loopy causes. Lubbock loved nature. He even kept a pet wasp, still lovingly preserved by his descendants. The cartoonists had a field day. He even claimed to have taught his dog to read. But he won popular support when he introduced Britain's first bank holiday. It was such a hit, it was nicknamed St. Lubbock's Day. As a boy, he never stopped drawing and cataloguing the natural world. His great-grandson Lyulph and grandson Eric have dug out his scrapbooks.
Some of these more primitive than others.
Butterflies.
Butterflies, so...
Actually, he was interested in butterflies long before that, wasn't he?
Indeed, yes.
From the age of what, 4?
I think
like
so,
that?
yes. I mean, there's a nice tale of him saying his earliest memory is of an insect under glass and Queen Victoria's coronation, so that gives us a nice date of 1837 when he'd been about 3½.
What would prove to be a fateful moment for British heritage came when Lubbock was 14. A neighbour was appointed to be his private tutor. It was none other than the man who would turn the Victorian world on its head. Scientist and philosopher Charles Darwin. Darwin was yet to publish his great work on the origin of the species, but he'd already developed his ideas about evolution, and the young Lubbock eagerly lapped them up.
What do you find of Darwin in the book?
Later on in this book, you'll see parts of insect appendages, and this particular insect is called Lepidoptera darwinii, and that's actually an insect that John discovered at High Elms in the ponds there, and he named it after what by then I think he regarded as his mentor.
Darwin ignited in the young Lubbock a passion for archaeology, a science still in its infancy in the 19th century. Darwin knew it was the key to unlocking man's past. Calculations based on the Old Testament meant that most people believed the world was only 4,000 years old. So the much older fossils and bones being dug up were the new wonders of the age, the first steps to building up a true picture of man's prehistoric past.
John Lubbock was gathering evidence of human antiquity to give a sense of evolution over time and over geography, of the human mind, of human culture, of human innovation, which was all part of the extension for him of natural selection in animal species.
In a museum in South London, we can still see Lubbock's passion for archaeology. Such finds inspired him to write his first book, Prehistoric Times. It quickly became a bestseller for the growing number of amateur archaeologists.
We're really very lucky when the Lubbock family very kindly decided to donate some of John Lubbock's items. We have here a hand axe. This is actually 300,000 years old. They'd have used it for killing and gutting their animals, taking the skins off. But if you look at it, it fits in your hand so beautifully. It's been made so well. We've also got one here, found from Orpington, and this is 60,000 years old. It's a big difference, but you can still see just how Stone Age tools were evolving and changing. And what we also have here, it's not such a local find, of course, but these things here, these are Neolithic. When John Lubbock published his Prehistoric Times in 1865, the main reason why the Prehistoric Times book now is so well known is he came up with the two terms Paleolithic and Neolithic, which means Old and New Stone Age. So this is actually Neolithic. You can see all the intricate details on it. We're not quite sure what they mean, what they represent. We assume it's something to do with someone standing in society. If you had this beautiful bit of carved stone, it meant you were quite an important person.
Lubbock was inventing the science of ancient history by giving it its own language for the first time. Next, he would put flesh on prehistoric bones. He commissioned the first illustrations of how life might have been for prehistoric man in Britain. And astonishingly, his pictures have stood the academic test of time. Ancient man hunting, ancient man working with tools, building shelters. And Lubbock's work encouraged interest beyond mere bones. The architectural remains of ancient Britain were suddenly big news.
One of the great things he did was to arouse our national attention into ancient monuments, into Stonehenge, the world of Avebury, of stone circles, and this was hugely important because this was about the roots of our identity. Who first settled these islands, how the British developed, and what really mattered. Who were we?
But Lubbock knew Britain's prehistoric remains were disappearing fast. They got in the way of efficient ploughing. And what's more, they were a free source of building materials for landowners keen to cut corners.
Prehistoric sites that he saw being destroyed on a daily basis through farmers building fences with stone or ploughing fields and so on. Every time that he went and visited those sites, he saw them whittled down further. And it was that threat which would destroy the evidence that Darwin had told him was so important in all his work to date. It was that threat that really is what he was concerned about.
In 1871, Lubbock heard that the land around Avebury village in Wiltshire, the site of Britain's largest prehistoric stone circle, was about to be sold at auction. Already subject to damage and dereliction for years, the future of the stone circle looked perilous. Lubbock decided something had to be done. His great-grandson and grandson remember the story.
He got a letter from the vicar here saying that there was a threat to the stones and urgently could he come down and have a look.
They were basically knocking them down and using them to construct.
People wanted them for building material.
Yes.
And they're valuable original materials for houses and other sorts of buildings. And they had been ravaged over a period of years, but this was a sudden onslaught against the few remaining stones.
And what they liked were these big ones, because they could then just take a slab like that and create a house around it. And people outside Avebury were coming in and chipping bits off as well, so it was just getting out of control, so something had to be done.
Lubbock moved fast. He persuaded local landowners, mostly farmers, to sell their land to him. The stone circle was saved. Inspired by what he'd achieved at Avebury, Lubbock decided to go into battle on behalf of all Britain's fragile prehistoric sites. And as an MP, he knew the only place the battle could be won decisively was Parliament. His Ancient Monuments Bill of 1873 proposed sweeping government powers to confiscate any prehistoric site deemed at risk from uncaring owners. It was a revolutionary proposal.
As a liberal, perhaps he felt that he could challenge the whole notion of property rights. But the Tories certainly weren't having it, and many liberals weren't either. And the notion that in some way the state could intervene and compulsorily take from a free-born Englishman his property was anathema. It really was.
For 8 long years, Lubbock tried and failed to get his bill through. By the 1880s, backbench wags were even calling it the monumentally ancient bill. Then, at last, in July 1882, the bill was voted into law. But victory had come at a price. The original bill had been hopelessly watered down.
When the bill was eventually passed, it lost its edge because it had lost the element of compulsion. And without compulsion, it was nothing really, because what it meant was that people had to voluntarily give their monuments to the government.
The new act listed 68 prehistoric sites the government wanted to take over. Lubbock knew it was going to be a challenge. But he also knew just the man for the job. Britain's first inspector of ancient monuments was to be Lieutenant General Augustus Pitt Rivers, a retired soldier turned archaeologist. His mission? To persuade owners to hand over their prehistoric structures in return for the government taking on the cost of repairs. Using the rapidly expanding rail network to crisscross the country, Pitt Rivers and his team set out on their tricky mission. And as they traveled the country, they recorded the look and condition of every monument they visited. The records they compiled have only recently come to light.
Here we have an album which is titled Our Ancient Monuments. Most of the album is made up of these watercolour images and also the site plans. In a number of examples we have members of the team who are depicted actually in the field. The sheer number of sites and monuments which he visited and also worked on and surveyed is immense.
Pitt Rivers and his team travelled the length and breadth of Britain, from Kent to Cumbria, from Newport in Wales to the Hebridean Isle of Lewis, photographing, drawing, painting. And there were even cork models showing how monuments sat in the landscape.
The sites range from sort of cairns to sort of dolmens to chambered tombs. And so the documentation that we have here, the models and the watercolours and the site plans and the photographs, I think is to show the historic condition and to show how vulnerable it was really to names being scratched into the stones and to other forms of damage.
The first monument Pitt Rivers visited, a Neolithic burial site in Kent known as Kit's Coty, was already badly defaced by graffiti. But its owner willingly surrendered control to the government. It was a good start, but almost immediately the complications of heritage became apparent. When Pitt Rivers asked for money to erect protective railings, still standing today, the Treasury kicked up a fuss. The bill was just £100. In the first year, 24 monuments across England, Scotland and Wales were taken into the protective custody of the government, safe forever from the hands of unsympathetic owners. But after the first year, The rate of monuments handed over slowed to a trickle as landowners showed their contempt for the act. Worst of all, Stonehenge remained in private hands and seriously at risk. The rubbish left by Victorian picnickers encouraged rats and rabbits, which undermined the monument. One of the uprights had fallen over, and a lintel had broken in two. Within a few years, it would be up for sale for just £125,000, amidst rumours of it being shipped overseas. Pitt Rivers felt powerless.
He found it terribly, terribly frustrating that he was given this highfalutin title, Inspector of Ancient Monuments. He was given a budget that was totally inadequate, and he was endlessly arguing with the Treasury about it. But despite all that, he really couldn't make an impact. It was a bit of a poisoned chalice, to be honest, and in the end, he more or less gave up, disillusioned.
And when Pitt Rivers died in May 1900, nobody even bothered to appoint a replacement inspector. The parliamentary initiative had failed. The heritage movement seemed over before it had begun. But for the ideas of heritage to get a hold, it would need to gain support beyond Parliament. It would need a prophet to win hearts and minds. In fact, it already had one, in the form of Victorian art critic and aesthete, John Ruskin.
Ruskin was speaking, I think, in a new way and seeing buildings as part of a national culture and suggesting that no one generation has the right to destroy or to alter, that historic buildings belong to a future.
With Ruskin, the idea of what we now call heritage begins, and he was the first person to say effectively, publicly, we do not own these things. They belong, he says, partly to the people who made them and partly to the people who come after us. And we are just custodians, and we have to think very carefully about what we're going to do with them while they're in our hands.
Ruskin grew up on the outskirts of South London. His father was a successful wine importer, but it was a family with intellectual and philanthropic interests. But the Britain of Ruskin's early years was changing fast, and by the mid-19th century there was industrialization and urban expansion on a scale never before seen. To Ruskin, it seemed as though Britain had taken a wrong turning, to embrace ugliness and deprivation.
It's almost hard now to imagine the impact it had. I mean, we all have some sort of vision of dark satanic mills and smoke and railways, but this was such a sudden, dramatic, huge change in human life, human endeavour, human history, and our common culture. It truly ripped people away from the countryside, from rural values. It urbanised people in a way that was at the speed of an express train.
Ruskin realised that the landscape, the built environment, represents memory, and memory was something that shouldn't be lost. Ruskin saw a world that was going to lose its memory, lose its texture, lose its essence in some way. So he was revolutionary, but that revolution involved turning back to the past and using the past as a way of stabilizing the present.
Ruskin spread his gospel through a string of books and packed lecture tours, and he went even further, preaching that unlimited industrialization would result in catastrophe.
What he talked about then, fiercely, was the fact that now we had to act. Our buildings being spoiled by basically pollution. We were breathing filthy air. And as he gave those lectures, and as the newspapers said, the man's a nutter, he's an idiot, he's a fool, he's dangerous, he's radical, what history tells us, it's fascinating, is that he was absolutely spot on.
Ruskin also forged a link between the environment and politics, arguing Britain's cities were out of control because, as he put it, we want one man to be always thinking and another to be always working. And we call one a gentleman and the other an operative. Whereas the workman ought often to be thinking and the thinker often to be working.
What he saw was that as the Industrial Revolution moved on, combined with a political economy that was ruthlessly capitalistic, where money mattered most of all, the profit motive mattered more than anything to do with the heart or the soul or the spirit, that old buildings, old customs, old ways of living would just be swept away. Karl Marx, of course, was talking about the same thing in different words at the same time.
In some ways, Ruskin's radicalism went even further than Marx. He believed it was the right of everyone to live in a beautiful setting. And fulfilling his own prophecy, Ruskin would repair to the Lake District. He bought a humble Georgian cottage overlooking Coniston Water, which he hugely, and not very beautifully, extended. Here he would come to think about the things that mattered and try to escape the encroaching industrial age.
Brantwood was really the place that Ruskin almost fled to escape celebrity. In his 50s, he had become celebrated, but also in a way pursued by the demons of his own creation, his commentaries on social justice and so forth. And he needed to come back to nature, to come back to the environment that in a way had been the wellspring of all those ideas and inspiration in his youth. He'd been not to Brantwood specifically, but to this field down in front of the house as an 18-year-old and sat and drawn the landscape opposite. So it was somewhere he knew. And the lakes, of course, represented the heritage of Wordsworth, the Romantics, the picturesque movement, the great landscape tradition of British art, all of the things that Ruskin had absorbed in his youth.
It was here Ruskin entertained sympathetic friends. Darwin came to supper 3 times. But even here, Ruskin fell prey to fits of gloom, overwhelmed by the immensity of all that was wrong with the world.
So this is Ruskin's bedroom. It's really the smallest little room in the house, right on the edge of the 18th century cottage, and a single bed which reminds you in a way of just how simple and lonely Ruskin was, but surrounded by the glorious colour of his Turner watercolours. These were the most precious and prized paintings that he had. That and a painting by his father, which was particularly special to him. So it's a room loaded from the beginning with a certain emotional symbolism. And it was also a room that became for Ruskin a centre of the breakdown that he had when he'd been here for 6 years. And the room became a place, in a sense, both of fear as well as sort of deep emotion to him. And he wasn't able to sleep in here in later years as a result of that. But one thing he did use throughout that period was a wonderful turret that he built on the corner of the bedroom, because he converted this small, dark little Lakeland room into a room that looks out, in a sense, on infinity.
And Ruskin needed a beacon, a distant and romantic cause, free from the confusion of chaotic Britain, where arguments would crystallize around absolute beauty facing total destruction. And he found it in Venice, a place he called the Golden City. In Venice, the great questions about the past, the present, and the future collided. It was simple. If nothing was done, Venice would be lost. As Ruskin wrote, the rate at which Venice is going is about that of a lump of sugar in tea. So he made Venice the first conservation crisis of the modern age. And he went further. History had to be saved in the right way, or it was worse than doing nothing at all. Already, one of the city's most spectacular medieval buildings had been changed forever by an overzealous and fanciful restoration.
If you look at before and after photographs of the Fundaka de Turkey, you see a building which is turned into a kind of a bleached skeleton of a building.
It was unforgivable, as Ruskin put it, to lose a building's golden stain of time.
Ruskin actually says that restoration is a lie, that you cannot restore a building. All you can do is prop it up if you want to actually preserve its essence. Now, that is a very, very radical position, and it's not a very practical one, because obviously buildings, keep having to be repaired. But that is the key difference between the 19th century desire to restore according to certain imaginary principles and the Ruskinian principle, which is much more the modern principle, is that you conserve, and if possible, your conservation is actually reversible.
For the first time, Ruskin was making the treatment of old and fragile buildings a moral issue, making it an absolute responsibility to get history right. In Britain, there'd always been people who cared passionately about the past. They were called antiquaries. The problem was, their grasp on history was often shaky. 18th century enthusiasts for Stonehenge got its date wrong by several thousand years and incorrectly attributed it to the Druids. But at least antiquaries knew the past mattered. A bigger problem was their habit of trophy hunting. What better souvenir than a chip off the old monument itself?
The idea that historic things should remain in the place from which it came was still not the view taken by a lot of people. There was a kind of, going around and shoving into your satchel things that you found. But, that attitude is incredibly prevalent. I always think of the Indiana Jones movies when, Indiana Jones was plunging into some temple and he kind of grabs an idol and says, "This should be in a museum," and puts it in his bag and off he goes.
In Holborn, in central London, is the house of architect Sir John Soane. It is still home to his great collection of ancient artifacts and curiosities, many of them taken from historical sites. It shows what Ruskin was up against, because even for a brilliant man like Soane, when it came to treasures and great monuments, he had more of a passion for shopping than a sense of place or authenticity.
All around are little, rather resonant fragments of Roman antiquities, or in this case, possibly even a little Egyptian piece of probably a leg of a great throne or altar. And then coming round, you have a selection of friezes and a selection of Greek and Roman busts as well, all perched on the balustrade, and you look down and there is possibly Soane's most splendid acquisition, the sarcophagus of the Egyptian king Seti I, about 3,000 years old. And then in the colonnade, yet more trophies, and a particular favourite is this splendid idol. It's the statue of Diana of Ephesus in this strange sort of quasi-oriental garb. Very splendid thing that Soane acquired in the 1820s, and he was inordinately proud of it.
The generation before Ruskin revelled in its dilettante attitudes. The first great collectors, even in the way they organised their treasures, had a different attitude from the one we know today.
During that period, what an object looked like and how it made you feel was absolutely as important as what it actually was. People were not so bothered by how old something was. What they wanted to do was to use these objects to create romantic interiors which concerned the past, but which were not historical reconstructions.
Well, here we are in the Monk's Parlour in the basement of Sir John Soane's museum, And this is a very atmospheric room that was devised by Sir John Soane in 1824. And he created here a very strange room, which he used as a kind of sanctuary, shall we say, for all the medieval and Gothic objects that he had acquired. Indeed, I think the only practical use to which we know this room was ever put, he used to have people to tea here, but otherwise it's a completely frivolous thing.
Ruskin was determined to overturn such attitudes, but it would fall to a more pragmatic disciple to achieve results. William Morris was a painter, textile designer, and libertarian socialist. A supporter of the arts and crafts movement, he looked for practical ways of reconciling history and modernity. And in an increasingly machine age, he set himself against factories and mass production, which he believed diminished people and their creativity. Handmade was best. Medieval craft skills, the very best. One summer day, he set off from his home on the Cotswolds in a horse and trap. For Morris, any Cotswolds jaunt was an inspiration, the finest in vernacular architecture to enjoy. He could not know he was set on a collision course with a Cotswold cleric. Today, the fine medieval church of St. John the Baptist in Burford, on the Oxfordshire-Gloucestershire border, looks peaceful enough. But not for the first or last time, a Church of England vicar had taken ancient architecture into his own inexpert hands.
Morris is driving around the countryside near Kelmscott one day, and he sees at Burford Church, this is in 1876, the vicar undertaking a part demolition of the building, and he tries to find out what's going on, and he even goes inside and sees the vicar removing some of the painted walls, the medieval wall paintings from the interior of the church, and he demands to know what's going on. And the vicar is said to have replied, "This, sir, is my church. I can do what I like in it. I can even stand on my head if I want to." And Morris is so outraged at the thought that people are having this attitude towards buildings that they've inherited from the past, that he decides something must be done about it.
Morris founded the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB for short. It was Britain's first effective pressure group devoted to saving old buildings. SPAB sent emissaries out across Britain to identify buildings at risk. It held public meetings to protest against overzealous restoration. And most importantly, it supervised sympathetic rescue work in a manner Ruskin would have approved.
It's important to remember that SPAB stands for the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, not the preservation of ancient buildings. And what Morris, saw was ancient buildings being given makeovers, literally, by ingenious amateurs who literally scraped everything off. Any evidence of the past was scraped away. Everything was made to look as new and nice as possible. And he regarded this as essentially the destruction of the evidence of time.
You can still see really horrible examples of this in churches all over the country, where they scraped off the plaster, thinking that the stone would be more authentic, you see. But of course it isn't. I mean, that kind of rubble stone looks really rough because the builders never intended it to be seen. And a lot of the plaster they were scraping off was medieval, and some of it had the remains of medieval wall paintings on it.
The SPAB approach is still practiced today as one of the more sensitive ways of dealing with an old building. At a terraced house in Waterloo, South London, owner and SPAB consultant Stephen Bull remains true to William Morris's principles.
The SPAB ethos is that everything should be reversible and you should be using materials which are sympathetic to the build. When you start using modern cements, then it's really detrimental to the structure of the building. The two should not really go together. If we have a look at the door frame, for example, the door frame has been damaged over a number of years. So what we've done here is, instead of using any modern fillers, we put inserts of timber in. You know, they look lovely and they're perfect. You know, you couldn't get a better finish than that, really. These are handmade nails. And what really Morris wanted more than anything else was just to have that simple handmade nail that's made by a craftsman. And when you look at it, it's a thing of beauty. You know, we're not talking about using nail guns here, and we're not talking about using kind of saber saws. I mean, everything has its place, but I do draw the line at a nail gun. And I think there's something humble about a handmade nail and applying it with a hammer. I mean, you couldn't get more basic than that. As far as the works we're doing here at the moment, it's essential that the house is put back into good heart. And it's a real priority to me that we're using the materials as near as possible to the way that it was actually built. So it's a repair that we're doing here. We're not doing a restoration, we're doing a conservation and repair. And if I just show you the door knocker on the outside, we don't want to replace this. This is kind of part of the history of the house. It has so many bashes on that that every mark tells a story. And I've got great affection towards this door knocker. Everyone says, well, why didn't you replace it with a brand new one? But to me, this is absolutely fabulous.
The last few decades of the 19th century saw more urban expansion and more pressure groups springing up. One in particular, though not directly concerned with old buildings, would help shape the birth of the heritage movement. The Commons Preservation Society was dedicated to saving urban green open spaces from being built on. Influential in the movement was the formidable figure of Miss Octavia Hill. As the Bishop of London said of her, "She spoke for half an hour. I never had such a beating in all my life." Born to a family of Victorian philanthropists, Hill began her life's mission buying a row of tenement houses and setting herself up as a landlady with a conscience.
Her philosophy on housing was very much that people needed decent places to live and needed then to take responsibility for those decent places to live. So she had no hesitation in throwing people out who didn't look after their houses and who didn't work and who were idle or inappropriate tenants. But if they did work and they did take responsibility, she was an incredibly good landlord, and she knew all her tenants intimately by name. She took an interest in them. She tried to get jobs for the children and to give them a sense of, you know, decent lives. She was quite remarkable for her time, you know, dealing with people in a way that women simply didn't.
Even today, Hill inspires a devoted following. In Wisbeach in Cambridgeshire, Hill's birthplace, another performance of An Evening with Octavia Hill is about to begin. Linda Eakins, Jo Sherry and Lorraine Carver assume the identities of Hill, her sister, and a close friend.
You were a bit emotional then, weren't you?
I know. I had to write her another letter to explain why I was in such a state, so that she wouldn't worry. Seeing the letters, I found that I could actually get an insight into her personality and the characters that she interacted with. You know, these poor people would benefit from open spaces to help them feel human. I think she was a selfless person who saw a need and knew what to do about it and went ahead and did it. I think we want 4 things. Places to sit in, places to play in, places to stroll in, and places to spend a day in. When it came to doing something that she was passionate about, when she was campaigning, when she was writing letters, when she was meeting people and talking about the things that she wanted to do. She didn't stand for any nonsense.
Give the fountain, you who will have the sea. Plant the plane trees. Place the seats, you to whom the woodlands will soon be accessible. You who know that soon below your feet will lie stretched the whole expanse of the sunlighted plain, and over whose head will bend the great space of fair summer sky. I am, sir, yours truly, Octavia Hill.
The biggest battles were inevitably in the most overcrowded cities, so the battle to save inner London green spaces was the toughest. Hill lost her fight to save Swiss cottage fields, but she resolved to fight harder.
She managed to save, in London, Hampstead Heath and Parliament Hill Fields from development, and today those are two hugely loved areas. Londoners today, or visitors to London, could hardly imagine Hampstead Heath not being there.
When Octavia Hill started trying to save Hampstead Heath, she was widely felt to be getting in the way of capitalist progress. I mean, she was doing something terrible. But she believed very strongly that there was such a thing as philanthropy.
The humorous magazine Punch depicted Hill's Open Spaces campaign, showing the urban poor in rapture, not to Hill herself, but the rather more seductive figure of nature personified. Such successes spurred her on. On the 16th of November 1893, at the offices of the Commons Preservation Society in Great College Street, Westminster, Octavia Hill, together with Lake District cleric Canon Hardwick Rawnsley and Post Office solicitor Robert Hunter, hosted a meeting for the great and the good. Their aim? To set up an organization that would address the plight of historic sites and natural scenery. It would be called the National Trust. Today, we associate the trust with country houses. But at the start, its focus was more radical: to loosen the stranglehold of private ownership on the countryside and increase public access. One of the Trust's first big campaigns was to save part of the Lake District from development. Brandle How, on the shores of Derwent Water in Cumbria.
There's nothing like a hot bath can't sort out here, is there?
In order to acquire the Brandle How Park in the Lake District, the Trust needed to raise about £6,500 in about 6 months. And what they did was they took their rattling cans to the cities of Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and they were gathering donations from ordinary working people who were desperate to have places to go tramping at the weekend. And they received money, lots of money this way.
That is the site of Manistee Saltwell, and this was in continuous use as a spa. Believe it or not.
I should imagine on a nice day it would look, you know, to relax and look around, but on a day like today, perhaps not.
Yes.
Octavia Hill, together with Rawnsley and Hunter, used the Lake District campaign to put the National Trust on the map.
Oh, it's gorgeous, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? It just meets the eye, doesn't it? You come round that bend and suddenly you're presented with this magnificent view.
Absolutely, yeah.
Takes a little bit of imagination here and there on a day like this, but so far so good.
In addition to the support from factory workers and miners, there was backing from the most influential too, not least in the shape of Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise. It was an early example of how the cause of heritage can make for unexpected bedfellows.
Here we are. We're surrounded by 4 oak trees. They each represent one of the 3 founding members of the National Trust, plus Princess Louise, who was here when Brandle How Woods were handed over to the National Trust. She was actually part of that ceremony.
Brandle How was saved. The infant National Trust was all about landscape, But then, almost by accident, buildings were on the agenda. From a small church in Sussex, an anxious vicar put pen to paper. He begged the Trust to rescue a broken-down medieval building known locally as Alfriston Clergy House. The Trust was keen. It represented another rapidly disappearing part of the landscape, the rural domestic dwelling.
There was this real sense of vernacular buildings being lost, and so Alfriston Clergy House was strongly felt to be in need of saving. It was in a terrible condition. Baby National Trust was able to buy it for £10, which has cost a lot more since then, I can tell you. And so alongside these open spaces was this kind of strong sense of the importance of vernacular architecture and nobody else being able to save it.
The National Trust would choose its now world-famous oak leaf symbol from a finely carved detail on one of the building's medieval timbers. But, alas, not many buildings or open spaces came as cheap as £10. And 5 years after the Trust was formed, its membership and its resources were still pitifully small. A new century dawned. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and the era promised change and modernity. Time to forget the past and look ahead. Across the Atlantic, a young and vibrant economy was on the rise. In America, self-made millionaires were in the mood to found a dynasty or two. What better way than going shopping in ye olde England? There were plenty of people keen to sell. Ancient architectural features and half-timbered medieval buildings were bought up and shipped across to the States. The cause of British heritage was in need of a new champion. Not this time a backbench MP hampered by Parliament, nor the well-meaning folk of charitable pressure groups, but a heavyweight. Enter the former Viceroy of India and High Tory, Lord Curzon of Kedleston. Nathaniel George Curzon had enjoyed a typically harsh but privileged aristocratic childhood. His superior bearing even inspired poetry. My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person. My cheeks are pink, my hair is sleek. I dine at Blenheim twice a week. Curzon had been Viceroy from 1899 to 1905, and in those 6 years he'd enjoyed absolute power over the lives of more people than any other ruler on earth. In his time in India, he'd also worked tirelessly to save beautiful and ancient structures all over India, including the Taj Mahal.
Curzon had introduced into India protections that didn't exist in England. And when he left as Viceroy, Nehru was to say of him, after memories of all the other Viceroys have vanished, Curzon will be remembered because he cared for all that is beautiful in India.
Back in Britain, it wasn't long before Curzon's blood was up. One of the most important buildings in the country was in peril. The rare and wonderful brick-built medieval castle of Tattershall in Lincolnshire was up for sale, and the Americans were sniffing round. Tattershall had been in decline for centuries. It had even been used as a cowshed, and by the 20th century the moats had been filled in. The castle keep was pretty much all that was left, and demolition looked likely. But its greatest treasures were still intact, the huge medieval fireplaces with their fine carving. In 1910, the castle came up for sale. An American syndicate looked interested, and one American buyer bought the fireplaces. They were torn out and packed up, ready to be shipped to the United States.
We're not sure what was going to happen to the rest of the castle. One story was one of these American gentlemen actually wanted it dismantled brick by brick and transported to the States, which I think would have been quite an undertaking given the size of the building.
Letters appeared in the Times newspaper. There was still a chance to buy back the castle, but the Infant National Trust couldn't afford it. It was Curzon's moment to rouse the conscience of the British establishment.
Lord Curzon stepped in at the last minute. He literally was given a 24-hour window of opportunity, after which the fireplaces were gone and the castle would no longer be available. And he paid the princely sum of £2,750 for the castle and the 8 acres of land.
Although the fire surrounds had already been carted away, Curzon was determined to intercept them and bring them back.
He used his powers as an MP, some say, to have all the docks and the harbours in the country watched and monitored. It was all very elusive and sort of dark and sinister what had happened to them.
At the 11th hour, the fire surrounds were discovered in a mews in the East End of London and brought back to the castle. They were paraded triumphantly through Tattershall village to much local rejoicing. Curzon felt at last the time had come for Parliament to take effective action.
Curzon, more or less single-handedly, guided through Parliament a bill that was intended to stop the desecration of a building like Tattershall Castle ever happening again.
In March 1913, the Ancient Monuments and Amendments Act was passed, giving the government real powers to act when ancient monuments and medieval buildings were at risk.
Curzon's bill, and I think it was really his bill, enabled the government through a complex procedure to step in and prevent a private owner from desecrating an ancient monument. And of course it reintroduced the idea of compulsion, the idea that was originally in Lubbock's Act, and had been biffed out by everybody in Parliament because they thought it was intolerable. That was put back in, and that was a very big change.
Appropriately, John Lubbock, the MP who had started it all, lived to see the bill become law, dying just 2 months later. And as he had always wanted, now landowners who abused the ancient monuments and medieval buildings in their care could be forced to repair them or be fined. Unpaid fines could even lead to imprisonment. At last, Britain had taken steps to protect its heritage. Even so, the legislation excluded anything built later than the medieval age, and any inhabited building. Some people saw it as little more than a ruins charter. But at last, the freedom to do what you liked as a landowner was over. In next week's programme, the clever men from the ministry who put the Ancient Monuments Act into practice after World War I. The revolutionary impact of the motorised lawnmower. The fight to save the English country house. And Hitler's plan to destroy Britain's best buildings. To find out how English heritage is celebrating 100 years of protecting the past, visit bbc.co.uk/Battle for Britain's Past.